In this video, I'll show you how you can solve a problem that involves several moving parts. In this case, the steps required to add feeder conductors. To do this right requires at least the following steps: adding new feeder conductor models, defining defaults for these feeder models, and adding ribbon options to draw feeders or to add them to segments. And then there's some other things to consider once you have the new feeder models. I'll touch on these at the end of the video. But before we get started, there's one more topic that really deserves to be first. Why do you need feeder models in the first place? Before I start, I want to ask, why do you need feeder models? Don't feeders use the same wires as primary conductors? Indeed, for many utilities, the same exact conductors are used for primary circuits and for feeders. Why can't you just use these primary conductor models in AUD? My question for clients is always the same. What in your AUD implementation will be different if a designer specifies a feeder as compared with specifying a primary conductor? Now, what do I mean by different? For example, should feeders be displayed on a different CAD layer? Or are they displayed differently than primary conductors, for example with a different color or a different line type? Or do you need to create a one-line sketch where the feeders are highlighted differently compared to primary lines? Or do you charge feeder construction to a different budget than primary construction? If you need to display or account for feeder conductors in a different way than primary conductors, then yes, you should have feeder models. Okay, let's get started. Step 1 is to add feeder-specific conductor models. On the Configuration tab, I'll select Industry Model. Here I'm working with the out-of-the-box configuration of AUD, and it currently has overhead and underground primary, secondary, and service conductors. Let's say that these three-phase primary models for 4/AUD ACSR, 6336.4 ACSR, and 7336.4 ACSR will also be used as feeder conductors. Now, the feeder conductor models will usually be almost exactly the same as the primary models, except for the model name, the description, maybe the model group, and the conductor type, which would be set to feeder conductor. There are several ways to add these new feeder models. You can simply do it in the Industry Model Editor. You can use the built-in functions within the Industry Model Editor to export the data to a comma delimited format, or you can use the SBS Smart Tools. I think Smart is the way to go. I'm going to use the Smart Tools Export Models option, which will dump all the model data to a spreadsheet with a whole lot of tabs. Okay, here's the spreadsheet that was created. I'll right-click here and select the tab with the conductor models. The nice thing about using Excel is that I can use the filter and display options to get things done fast. I'll turn on the column filters and filter on conductor type so I only see the primary models. Here are the 3 wires that I need to copy to create the feeder models. I'll select these 3 rows, choose Copy, and then click in the first empty row here and select Paste. Now I'll make the essential changes. First and most important, I'll create a new unique model name for each of these 3 models, replacing 3PH with feeder, FDR. Next, and just as important, I'll set the model group to feeder conductor and the conductor type to feeder conductor. One side note here, the conductor type field within AUD is a domain. What goes here has to exactly match the text that's defined within the domain. Otherwise, the data won't import correctly back into AUD. For the sake of this demo, these are the only 3 fields that will be different. Everything else about these conductors, their physical characteristics, the description, even the CUs remain the same, because from the standpoint of ordering the parts and analyzing the conductors, they're essentially the same as the primary wires. I'll save the spreadsheet and switch back again to AUD. Using again Smart Tools, I'll import the model data spreadsheet. I'll start the Industry Model Editor and take a look at the conductors, and you can now see that the new models are available. Now let's take a look at the ribbon where you'll see the electric overhead panel. If I click on the down arrow at the bottom, you can see the electric overhead defaults. For conductors, we have choices for primary, secondary, and service. No feeders. If we look at the available primary overhead conductors in the list here, you can see that the only available sections are for primary conductors. Overhead, secondary, and service conductors don't show, nor do any underground conductors. And if I look at the available options to draw overhead conductors, the only options are to draw primary, secondary, and service conductors. Again, no feeders. So let's deal with the defaults first. And to do that, I'm going to take a quick look at the conductor type domain. I'll launch the domain editor and locate conductor type. Note the available conductor types, and in particular note the ID numbers, and the ID for feeder is 10, while the ID for primary is 4. We're going to need this information shortly. And before we leave the domain editor, let's take a quick look at the domain for conductor construction, because I'm going to reference this in a few minutes as well. In particular, note the 4 values associated with overhead construction: slack, full tension, slack twisted, and full tension twisted. I'll now go to the Configuration tab and select the AUD Options command. There are many different parts to AUD options, but in this case I'm going to choose Default Profiles. I'm just going to modify the existing default profile. I'll select the profile, click on Collection, and click on the ellipsis to the right. Here you can see all of the subsections, which in here are called members, for both overhead defaults and for underground defaults. With regard to overhead items, there are options for overhead communications, overhead primary, secondary, service, and neutral, and just overhead. These correspond to the different sections of the overhead defaults pull-down. Again, there's nothing here for feeders. Let's take a quick look at the section for primary overhead to see how it's been implemented. The display name controls the label for the subsection on the overhead electric pull-down. The installation is overhead. This becomes important when creating the ribbon macros. And the line type is primary. This may sound like it makes perfect sense, but later in this video we'll learn how the line type, in conjunction with installation, is used for reference within the ribbons macro. The order number is 1. This means that the primary section will appear at the top on the left side of the default pull-down. This is because the odd numbers go on the left, even numbers on the right, and items appear in order starting with the lowest numbers at the top. If I select Collection and click on the ellipsis, I can see there are 3 parts to this subsection. These correspond to the 3 entries in the primary part of the display. The first entry, EL Conductor, provides defaults for the components in the conductor feature class. The underlying table name is EL Conductor. Let's expand this collection. Remember that not all conductor models appeared in the overhead primary section. That's because they're filtered. In this case, they're filtered on conductor type and conductor construction. I'll expand the collection for ID conductor type, and there you see the number 4. This is the ID for the entry primary in the conductor type domain. And if I expand the collection for ID conductor construction, I see 4 numbers which correspond to the 4 overhead construction types within the conductor construction domain. Great. Let's create our new feeder subsection. I'll click on Cancel till I'm back here. I'll click on Add to define a new member, a new subsection. I'll make the display name Feeder, set installation to overhead, and set the line type to feeder. I want feeders to appear above primaries in the display, so I'll set the order number to 1. Note before I finish, I'll have to change the order numbers for the other members in order to get the display I want. Now I'll expand the collection, which of course is empty to begin. I'll click Add to create the first entry and enter EL Conductor for the feature class name. I'll do this 2 more times to create entries for EL Pole and EL Pole Head. And for Pole Head, I'll set the Is Initial Model Group to True. There isn't time to go into the details in this video, but the pole head default is usually to identify a category of pole head, like horizontal, vertical, or compact, not a specific model. Now I'll select EL Conductor and expand the collection. I'll click on Add and set the model attribute name to ID Conductor Type. I'll expand this collection and enter 10. Remember, this is the ID associated with feeder conductors within the conductor type domain. I'll go back and add the attribute ID conductor construction and enter the same 4 numbers that were set for primary conductor construction. Almost done. I'll press OK a couple times to get back to the main screen. The last thing to do is to change the order number for primary overhead to 3, for service overhead to 5, and for overhead communications to 7. I'll click on OK to finish. And now you can see our revised overhead defaults panel. And if I review my choices for feeder defaults, I'll see only 3 conductors that I've defined earlier in this video. Having feeder conductors and feeder conductor defaults isn't much use if they aren't available on the ribbon. So the next step is to modify the ribbon to have additional feeder choices. Note that ideally you should create a partial customization file, also known as a partial COI file, so that your ribbon is managed separately from the ribbon provided as part of AUD. However, the steps to do this are a bit complicated and we don't have time to cover it in this video. So for now, I'm just demonstrating the changes using the out-of-the-box AUD electric distribution COIX file. I'll type COI at the command line and launch the COI editor. In the upper left, I'll choose the file I want to modify. In this case, AUD electric distribution.coix. I'll then expand the ribbon section and under that the panels section. Now I'll expand the electric overhead panel and I'll keep on expanding things until finally I get to the draw overhead pull down. So now you can see here the options starting with draw primary line that are controlling what appears on the actual ribbon. Basically, what I want to do is add a command similar to draw primary line, except for feeder conductors. So here's the process to follow. First, I'll select the draw primary line command. You can see the details of the command off to the right, and you can see the actual command name down here in the lower left. And this is very important. I need to do this work using the selection in the lower left. I'll locate the primary line command in the command section here within the lower left of the COI editor, and I'll select that command. Next, I'll make a duplicate of the primary line command by right-clicking on the command in the command section. The duplicate will be highlighted in the command section, and the information within this duplicate appears on the right. In this properties section on the right, I'll update the name to be feeder line, and I'll update the description. Next, I'll select the macro and click on the ellipsis so I can edit it more easily. Before I do any editing, let me explain this macro. The macro uses the AUD line feature command. Indeed, you could learn a lot more about how these macros work by typing AUD line feature at the command line and following the prompts. The segment parameter indicates the new line feature will be contained within a segment. Next is the parameter installation, which refers to the installation field in our default definitions, and it's being set to overhead. This indicates that we're looking at one of the defaults defined for overhead components. Next, we see the parameter line type, which is being set to primary. The combination of these two parameters, installation and line type, is basically identifying which subsection or member is being chosen within the defaults. So now we know we're looking at the defaults associated with overhead primary components. Next, we see the parameter features. Everything from this point on is determining what AUD features will be inserted into your drawing. In this case, a conductor is being inserted. Which conductor? The one within the referenced subsection, the overhead primary subsection in this case. The structure parameter then indicates we're defining structures associated with this conductor, and there are 2 entries here, EL pole and EL pole head. Which pole and which pole head? Again, the ones within the overhead primary subsection. So all we have to do is change this from primary to feeder. Then this macro will reference the new overhead feeder default subsection. I'll press OK to complete the creation of my command, but we're not quite done. I still have to add the new command to the ribbon. So I'll find the command here in the command list. I'll select the new command and I'll drag it into the draw overhead section. Note on the right that the command is currently called feeder line, and I should give it a name that's more consistent with the other names. Now I can click on OK. I'll look at the revised ribbon, and there's my new command. Let's test it out. I'll first set the default value, and now I'll select the new command and draw an overhead segment. I'll select the model within the segment, and there you have it, my new feeder conductor. Let's review what we covered. First, I talked about why you might need to have feeder conductors models in your AUD configuration. We then looked at the steps required to add new models to the list of available conductor models and the model attributes that define a conductor as a feeder. We then created the new feeder models. We used the SPS Smart tools for editing models in Excel and creating 3 new conductor models with the conductor type set to feeder conductor. These new models were loaded into AUD. Then we modified the electric overhead default pull-down to include default support for feeder conductors, along with the other things you would need with the feeders. And finally, we modified the ribbon to have a new option, draw a feeder line, that would use the new defaults. There are many additional steps to consider that we didn't have time for in this video. With regards to the default settings, it may be that only certain pole models are valid for feeders. In this case, we could create additional filters within the default setup for poles. On the ribbon, there are usually additional commands associated with each type of conductor. For example, you might want to add feeders to an existing segment, or you might want to add a feeder and a neutral at the same time. You can usually figure out how to do this by looking at the existing ribbon macros. Validation rule updates. It's likely that existing validation rules may need to be updated. For example, some components are only supposed to be connected to feeders, or just feeders and primary lines, and your validation rules should be improved to reflect this. In addition, your utility may display or style feeders differently from primary conductors. You may want to define new styles within the conductor feature class and then update the conductor styling rules to take advantage of these new styles. Look for more videos on these and other topics in the future.